Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. You've brought us a case that really shook Los Angeles, the Watts Rebellion of 1965, and we've got official reports, firsthand accounts, analyses.
Yeah, it's a complicated event. We're going beyond just the 6 days of chaos, sort of, into the conditions that caused this
The
eruption.
Watts Rebellion didn't just come out of nowhere, right? It started with Marquette Frye's arrest on August 11th, 1965. But that wasn't the whole story.
Exactly. For decades, discriminatory housing practices forced Black residents into overcrowded, neglected neighborhoods like Watts, and then you layer on high unemployment poverty on top of that. I mean, you can see how tensions were already high.
So it's August 11th, 1965, a hot summer night in Watts. Marquette Frye, a young black man, gets pulled over by a white highway patrolman who thinks he might be drunk driving.
The official police report claims there was a struggle. Frye resisted arrest. Things escalated. But the witness accounts tell a different story, and those stories spread fast.
There was a particularly strong rumor that Frye's mother, who came to the scene, was wearing a barber's smock and was pregnant, and this led people to believe wrongly that the police had hurt her.
That rumor, even though it turned out to be false, is a perfect example of how misinformation can make a tense situation explode. It shows how much distrust there already was between the Watts community and the police.
And that's how the Watts Rebellion started. Over 6 days, violence took over the neighborhood. There was arson, looting attacks on drivers, even firefights with the police.
And it's important to grasp the different kinds of violence. Almost 1,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, which shows the huge amount of property damage. But the human cost was also devastating. 34 people died, including a fireman, a deputy sheriff, a Long Beach police officer. Over 1,000 people were injured.
The scale of it is hard to comprehend. But behind those numbers, we have these individual stories, these voices from the ground that show the raw emotions of those 6 days.
Some of the quotes from that time really capture that. One that sticks out is from a Black woman who warned the authorities about the tiger by the tail.
She actually said, "You created this monster, and it's going to consume you. White man, you got a tiger by the tail. You can't hold it. You can't let it go. The next time you see us, we'll be carrying guns. It's too late, white man. You had your chance. Now it's our turn."
That quote speaks volumes. It shows the anger and frustration that had been building for years. People felt their peaceful calls for change had been ignored and that they had to take stronger action.
It really makes you think the Watts Rebellion wasn't just about one arrest. It was the result of years of inequality and resentment building up.
The LAPD was completely overwhelmed at first. They couldn't control the riots.
The National Guard arrived on August 12, 1965, which was a turning point. They had heavy weapons and tactics that helped stop the violence in the short term.
But the National Guard's presence also made residents angry. Many saw it as a military occupation, which added another layer of complexity to the chaos.
It's interesting that even with all the violence, there were people trying to mediate and keep the peace.
Yes. People and groups tried to bridge the gap between the authorities and the community. They organized meetings, tried to start conversations, worked to de-escalate the situation.
What I'm wondering is, did any of those efforts work? Did they achieve anything at all?
While they had good intentions, these efforts often failed because of communication breakdowns and a lack of trust. The violence had created such a divide that finding common ground was nearly impossible.
So when the Watts Rebellion ended, Los Angeles was left with a lot of questions and scars. But it also forced people to confront racial inequality, not just in Los Angeles, but across the country.
Right. The Watts Rebellion became a symbol of the civil rights movement and exposed the systemic problems that had been ignored for far too long.
The McConey Commission, which investigated the riots, pointed to these root causes: poverty, unemployment, inadequate housing-tense relations between the police and the community. But I think it's time we talked about Friday, August 13th, 1965.
That was a particularly disturbing day. Crowds started gathering at Avalon Boulevard and 103rd Street, close to where Marquette Frye was arrested just 2 days earlier.
By late afternoon, the situation had escalated rapidly. The crowd became increasingly hostile and violent.
What's striking about that day is how quickly and intensely the violence spread. Shops were looted and set on fire, cars were flipped and burned, and gunfire filled the streets.
It's hard to imagine what it must have been like, smoke filling the air. The constant sound of breaking glass and sirens terrified residents trying to escape.
There's a particularly harrowing account of a fireman who was shot while responding to a call. He was hit in the leg by a sniper, which shows the extreme danger faced by first responders.
Amidst all the chaos, there were also reports of incredible bravery and compassion. People helped each other get out of burning buildings, shared what little food and water they had, and tried to protect the most vulnerable.
These acts of humanity, although often overlooked because of the violence, remind us that even in the worst situations, there's still hope and compassion.
Unfortunately, the violence didn't end with Friday the 13th. The rebellion continued through the weekend, fueled by anger, frustration, and a sense that things were spiraling out of control.
As the weekend went on, a sense of lawlessness and desperation took over. It became hard to tell who was a rioter, who was a looter, and who was just a desperate resident.
By Sunday, the National Guard had a strong presence in Watts. They imposed a strict curfew and used forceful tactics to try to restore order.
Even with the increased military presence, there were still outbreaks of violence. Snipers targeted law enforcement and firefighters, and clashes between residents and authorities became more frequent.
The violence didn't really stop until Monday, August 16th, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a city struggling to deal with the aftermath of one of the most devastating riots in American history.
After the rebellion ended, the focus shifted to understanding what caused it and finding solutions. But that's a conversation for another time. Looking back at these accounts, it's clear there was a huge disconnect between the authorities and the Watts community.
Yeah, it seems like they were speaking completely different languages. Neither side understood or trusted the other.
That's exactly right, and we see this in how community mediation attempts failed, mostly because of communication breakdowns and just deep-seated distrust.
It really shows how years of inequality and negative interactions can just destroy trust between law enforcement and the communities they're supposed to serve.
The McConey Commission report, which we talked about earlier, goes into this issue in detail. It stresses the need for better relations between the police and the community, but it also highlights these bigger social problems at play.
So it wasn't just about changing police tactics. It was about addressing these underlying economic and social inequalities that caused this explosion in the first place.
Precisely, and that's where things become even more complex because these systemic issues, poverty, unemployment, lack of access to quality education and healthcare, these are deeply rooted and need long-term solutions.
Solutions that sadly haven't been fully put into place in the decades since the Watts Rebellion.
It's a sobering thought that despite the calls for change, the same issues that fueled the rebellion still affect many communities today.
It shows that understanding the past is only the first step. We have to use that knowledge to make difference and work towards a fairer and more just future.
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the role of the media during the Watts Rebellion. The coverage at the time was extensive, but it was also problematic at times.
That's true. Some accounts argue that the media, especially television coverage, actually made the violence worse by sensationalizing events, focusing on the most dramatic and destructive aspects of the rebellion.
There's some truth to that argument. It's a tough balance to strike, reporting accurately while also being careful not to inflame an already dangerous situation.
This raises an important question. How can we ensure responsible media coverage during times of social unrest? How do we balance informing the public with avoiding further harm?
That's a question journalists and media organizations grapple with constantly. And it's also something that we as news consumers should be aware of and think critically about.
You're right. Being discerning consumers of media is especially important during crises. It means being aware of our own biases, questioning what we see and hear, and looking for different perspectives.
And that leads us to another crucial aspect of the Watts Rebellion, the different narratives and perspectives that came out of it.
On the one hand, you have the official narratives from law enforcement and government officials, which often focused on restoring order and cracking down on crime.
And then you have the voices from the ground, the people who lived in Watts and experienced the rebellion firsthand. Their stories paint a very different picture.
Their stories often focused on themes of frustration, anger, and feeling ignored and marginalized for years.
We need to pay close attention to those voices because they offer a more nuanced and complex understanding of the rebellion and its causes.
They remind us that the Watts Rebellion wasn't a random act of violence. It was a response, however, misguided to a long history of systemic inequalities.
And it's those systemic issues we need to fix if we want to prevent similar events from happening again.
Talking about fixing those issues, let's look at what happened after the Watts Rebellion. It's a period marked by both hope and disillusionment.
There was a surge of activism and organizing within the Watts community and beyond. The rebellion had brought national attention to the struggles of Black Americans, and many saw it as a chance for real change.
There were demands for reforms in housing, education, employment, police community relations. There was a push for civil rights legislation and a feeling that maybe things would be different this time.
But that optimism was dampened by the slow pace of change and the continued resistance from those in power.
Many Watts residents felt that the promises made after the rebellion were empty, that the issues that led to the unrest were still largely unaddressed.
And that leads to a question that's still relevant today.
Right.
Have we really learned from the Watts Rebellion? Have we made any real progress in addressing the root causes of social unrest?
It's a question we each need to think about as we reflect on this pivotal moment in American history.
As we consider the events in Watts, it's important to remember that the issues that fueled the rebellion, poverty, discrimination, police brutality, aren't limited to one neighborhood or one point in time.
These are systemic issues that affect communities all over America. The Watts Rebellion shows what can happen when we ignore these issues.
So moving forward, we must not just remember the past, but also use the lessons from events like the Watts Rebellion to guide our actions and work towards a more just and equitable society for everyone.
One way to honor the legacy of the Watts Rebellion is to amplify the voices of those who continue to fight for social justice and equality.
You're absolutely right. It's about listening to and supporting those on the front lines, those who are working to dismantle oppressive systems and build a more inclusive and just world.
And it's about realizing that the fight for justice isn't over. Each of us has a part to play.
Exactly. We must all be willing to challenge our own biases, speak out against injustice, and use our voices and actions to create a society where events like the Watts Rebellion belong in history books, not on our streets.
You know, that Sunday during the riot was particularly brutal. It seemed like a free-for-all of violence and destruction.
There are accounts that describe roving gangs, both black and white, terrorizing the streets. Some were armed with guns, others with makeshift weapons like pipes and chains.
Some sources say there was a lot of anger directed at white-owned businesses, seen as symbols of the economic disparity and oppression that black residents faced.
The reports describe systematic looting and arson with entire blocks of businesses reduced to smoldering rubble. The financial cost of the damage was staggering, but the impact on the community went far beyond just dollars and cents.
It's hard to imagine the terror those business owners must have felt watching their livelihoods go up in flames.
You're right. It's a stark reminder of the raw, visceral nature of mob violence, how quickly order can break down, and how fear and anger can drive people to commit acts they might never consider under normal circumstances.
And on top of the property damage, there was the constant threat of violence against individuals, both residents and those who found themselves caught in the crossfire.
One particularly disturbing aspect of the Sunday violence was the emergence of sniper fire. Law enforcement and firefighters were targeted, making it incredibly dangerous to try and restore order or put out fires.
There are accounts of residents huddled in their homes, terrified to venture out as bullets whizzed through the streets.
It's important to note that not everyone in Watts participated in the violence. Many residents were caught in the middle, desperately trying to survive and protect their families.
Right. There are stories of neighbors helping each other, sharing what little food and water they had, and trying to create safe spaces amidst the chaos.
But even those who weren't actively involved were deeply affected by the events. The trauma of those 6 days left an indelible mark on the community.
It's like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for the violence to subside, and wondering what would be left in its wake.
The Sunday of the Watts Rebellion stands as a grim testament to the destructive power of unchecked rage and the profound impact it can have on individuals, communities, and cities as a whole.
Monday, August 16th brought a fragile sense of calm. The intense fighting and widespread arson of the previous days seemed to have exhausted themselves.
Exhausted, perhaps, but the city was on edge. The previous days of unrelenting violence had taken a toll.
The National Guard had a firm grip on Watts, enforcing the strict curfew. Military vehicles patrolled the streets. Soldiers stood guard at key intersections. There was an unsettling quiet, punctuated by the occasional sound of a helicopter overhead.
It wasn't truly peace, more like a tense standoff. The anger and frustration that had fueled the rebellion were still simmering beneath the surface.
You could feel the weight of suspicion and resentment hanging in the air.
Yes, the community was shattered, broken glass, and charred debris littered the streets, a stark reminder of the destruction.
I came across an account from a resident who described walking through their neighborhood on that Monday. It was like walking through a ghost town.
Many residents were still too afraid to leave their homes, while others began the daunting task of cleaning up the wreckage. The physical damage was overwhelming, but the psychological scars ran even deeper.
The events of the past few days had irrevocably changed Watts and Los Angeles as a whole. The rebellion had exposed deep racial and social divides, leaving behind a legacy of pain, anger, and distrust.
It's important to remember that the end of the rioting didn't mean the end of the struggle for racial justice. The Watts Rebellion served as a wake-up call, forcing the nation to confront the realities of inequality and discrimination.
Despite the uneasy quiet that Monday marked a turning point, the conversation shifted from containment to recovery, from quelling the violence to addressing its root causes.
While the McCone Commission would delve into those causes, the true work of healing and rebuilding would fall on the shoulders of the Watts community and the nation as a whole.
The events of August 16th served as a stark reminder that true peace goes beyond the absence of violence. It requires addressing the underlying injustices that fuel unrest and working towards a more equitable and just society.
It's easy to focus on the, big picture of the Watts Rebellion, but we can't forget that this was a human tragedy with real people at the heart of it.
Yeah, behind the statistics and the headlines, there were families torn apart, businesses destroyed, and a community left dealing with trauma and loss.
That trauma didn't just vanish when the riots ended. It had a lasting effect on Watts and shaped the generations that came after.
When the McCone Commission investigated the root causes of the rebellion, they uncovered some disturbing realities about life in Watts before the violence erupted. What stood out to you?
Well, the report highlighted the severe overcrowding and terrible housing conditions in Watts. Many people were living in rundown buildings, often without proper sanitation or basic amenities.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine trying to raise a family or build a stable life in those conditions.
Exactly. And that lack of basic resources combined with high unemployment and limited access to good education, it trapped people in a cycle of poverty and despair that was incredibly difficult to escape.
It's almost as if the Watts community was set up to fail, systematically denied the opportunities and resources that other parts of Los Angeles had.
That's a tough statement, but there's definitely some truth to it. The report pointed to discriminatory practices in housing, employment, and education that effectively pushed the Watts community to the margins.
It really highlights that the Watts Rebellion wasn't just a random outburst of violence. It was a consequence of deep-seated inequalities that had been ignored for far too long.
That's a lesson we as a society need to take to heart. We can't just address the symptoms of social unrest. We have to tackle the root causes if we want to create a fairer and more just future for everyone.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from the Watts Rebellion, and how can we apply those lessons to the problems we face today?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think one key takeaway is the importance of investing in communities that have been historically marginalized and disadvantaged.
That means providing equal access to good education, affordable housing, job training programs, healthcare.
It also means encouraging real conversations and understanding between communities and law enforcement, building trust and mutual respect instead of suspicion and hostility.
It's a long road, but the Watts Rebellion shows us that the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the investment needed to create a more just and equal society.
And it's a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight. It requires sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to challenge the way things are.
That's a powerful thought as we finish our look at the Watts Rebellion. I think the most important question for each of us is this: what can we do to create a future where events like this never happen again?
That's a question we should all think about. I believe it starts by acknowledging that we're all part of a larger system and that our actions, no matter how small, can either contribute to or help dismantle systems of inequality.
Yeah, it's about being informed, engaged citizens. It's about speaking out against injustice, supporting organizations, working for positive change, and holding our leaders accountable.
And it's about remembering the lessons of the past, not just as historical events, but as warnings that can guide us toward a better future.
Well said. Simon and Tom will discuss this case in their weekly review on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.